two important melachot, kosher and matir. Kosher means to make knot, to tie. Matir means to untie, the exact opposite. To tie means to attach two things, like two pieces of rope or thread, and usually it's intended for permanence. But as we will see later, there are different types of knots, some that are not as permanent. But the real melacha, at least doraita, the idea behind kosher is to make a permanent knot. There is, however, a question as to what kind of a permanent knot. As you know, there's various types of knots, various shapes and forms, what constitutes permanent, and so forth. The main machloket goes as follows. The Rambam, some other poskim hold, that in order for a knot to be prohibited midoraita, prohibited in other words from making or from undoing, as we will see later, it needs to have two characteristics. One is that it's called a kesher shel kayama. It has to be a permanent knot, intended for permanence, not something that you tie and untie regularly. And number two, it has to be a maaseh oman. It has to be a professional knot. That's what the translation of this means. A professional knot is a good knot, not just a loose knot. You can have a loose, simple knot that you have in mind to keep it forever or for a long time. Professional means like they use for anchors of boats, real tough knots, right? That is done professionally. You can see that it was tied in a way that it should last. According to this opinion, therefore, if one of those conditions are missing, it doesn't mean that it's mutar. It would still be asur, at least in the Rabbanan, the rabbinic decree, and it would not be asur midoraita, but it would still be asur. It would not be permissible to make a knot if it has one of these characteristics. According to Rashi and others, they hold that there is no such thing as a need to have a kesher that was done maaseh uman by a professional. As long as it's a kesher shel kayama, that's the main criteria. The most important condition for prohibiting a knot is it permanent or not. If it's a temporary knot, it's mutar, or it can be mutar, you'll see. And if it's permanent, it's asur, regardless of how it was done. We're concerned with the length of time. We're concerned with whether it was done permanently or not. We are more stringent today. We take into consideration the Rambam's opinion, and therefore, if one of those two are to be found in the knot, it will be asur. In other words, if it's professional knot but it's not permanent, or if it's permanent even if it's not professional, right? We are stringent, and at least by rabbinic decree, none of those knots, even with just one of the conditions, will be asur to make on Shabbat. Included in this melacha is petilat chotim, or what would be called in English twining, or braiding. As we explained, I believe last week when we were talking about tviyah, which is the combining of the threads, right? The weaving, or not the weaving, but the spinning of the wool. So you can actually take several threads or several strings to make a thicker thread. According to the Rambam, at least, that would also be a form of kosher, not a form of tviyah. We talked about the issue of spinning, which really involves taking many threads, twisting them, or spinning them into one, thicker. According to the Rambam, that would fall under kosher. So anything that's similar to that would also be asur, either under kosher or under tviyah. So before we go on and see what the parameters are, the various different types of knots, I thought that it would be a good idea just to discuss briefly what the difference between sofer and kosher is. Next week, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll be talking about sofer. Sofer is to sew, right? And this is to tie. They both appear to be similar. When you are sewing a garment, you are tying two pieces together of something, right? And aren't you doing the same thing with kosher? But they're very, very different, even though they appear to be similar. There are many melachot, by the way, as you probably have seen, that are similar but are different in the end. Same thing with sofer and kosher. What happens with sofer? You are sewing two things together, and they become one unit after sewing them together. The only way to undo them easily is by tearing them. You do not easily go back to the original state of having two. Now you have one. You have a completely different unit. That's called sofer. Whereas kosher, you're tying two things together, but you can easily, hopefully, it may not be so easy, but you can undo them, and when you undo them, you bring them back to their original state that they were before. So yes, you're combining two separate things, but you haven't created anything new with kosher. The kesher, the knot, is what's prohibited. With sofer, it's the union of these two things that is prohibited, but they're both done in a different way. So there are two separate melachot. We said before that even though a kesher may not be asur midoraita, it can still be asur midorabanan. And there are various criteria of what makes a kesher asur midorabanan. In other words, by rabbinic decree, something that we would not be able to do on Shabbat. The only kesher that would be an easy one that everybody would agree that you can make is something that does not have, is not even called a kesher. What would that be? Something that you can easily, perhaps with one hand, just undo. And I'm going to give you various examples of sharim. One that is very easily undone is really not a kesher to begin with, and it will be completely mutar. That would be called in Hebrew maaseh hedyot. Maaseh hedyot is an unprofessional knot, that which is done by anybody, and it can be easily undone. However, there are still, nevertheless, various types of knots that, even though they're not asur midoraita, they are asur midorabanan because they resemble, or because they last for a long period of time. And we're concerned that one of the criteria of a kesher shel kayama is that it's done for permanence. Now the question is, what is permanent? So let's talk about that. The criteria or the parameters, I put it a little higher there, of a kesher shel kayama. What's called kesher shel kayama? Permanent. Does permanence really mean forever? Well, that's what it's supposed to mean. But some say that even if it's made to last more than 24 hours, it's already considered a permanent. It's made to last long. Some say 7 days. Some say more than 7 days. Everybody therefore agrees that anything within 24 hours is not a permanent knot. So we do have quite a few opinions as to what permanence is, but everybody agrees that if it was done for 24 hours, even though in the end it turned out that it lasted longer. You didn't intend it to. You intended to tie it, untie it regularly. Right? So if it's within 24 hours, a very short period of time, everybody agrees that that would be mutar. As long as it's not a maaseh uman. Right? You still have to be careful with professional knot. Even though you intend it to be for a short period of time, that's still asur, according to the Rambam. So if it's not a maaseh uman, if it's not a professional knot, if it's under 24 hours, there would be no problem. Kesher zmani is the opposite of a kesher shel kayama, as I translate here, a temporary knot. With temporary knots, what's important is not the time, it's the intention. In other words, we consider something a temporary knot if you intended it to be temporary. So of course, there's a question, what if it's going to be for 7 days? Is that considered temporary knot, right? So yes, there are different opinions about what is considered temporary, but the main thing over here is not the amount of time that it's actually going to be, it's the intention. If you intend for something, for a knot to be temporary, then it's not a permanent knot, right? A permanent knot, by the way one makes it, and by his intention, one can tell that it was made to be permanent. With a kesher zmani, with a temporary knot, it's completely up to the person's intention. There can be knots that are very simple and very loose, and they could be permanent, as we'll talk about the various examples. Or it could be that it was done temporarily. So the temporary knot, the way we determine if something is temporary is really purely by the intention, not necessarily by how it was tied. We do run into a problem when we have tight knots. A very, very tight knot, even though it may be temporary, because it's tight, it comes under the category of maaseh uman, right? So therefore, it can be a problem. These things can pose a problem, not only in making them, but as we will soon see, in undoing them. Because there is a rule in Shabbat that whatever is asur likshor, asur le'atir. Generally speaking, midoraita. Whatever is asur midoraita to tie, it would be asur for us to untie. But there are some differences nevertheless, and I put it down under leniency on the other side, the differences between le'atir and likshor. But generally speaking, anything that's asur midoraita, that has those two criteria of maaseh uman or kesher shel kayama, which can be asur midoraita, at least according to Rashi, if it's at least a kesher shel kayama, then it would be asur, prohibited to undo them. So we have to determine what the kesher is, if it's a kesher shel kayama or if it was a kesher zmani, to know if it's permissible to undo or not. Because as you will see, if it's a kesher zmani under certain circumstances, it would be permitted to undo. Versus a kesher shel kayama that almost under no circumstances can it be undone. Nevertheless, there is a way to even undo a kesher shel kayama. Not by undoing, but by breaking, severing. So we'll get to that soon. Okay, just like a tight knot is a problem knot because it appears to be a kesher shel kayama, you can have several ksharim, several knots that even though they were made to last for a long time, that would come under, or it would appear to be a kesher shel kayama just because of its duration. Nevertheless, if it's rofeh, if it's loose, it's permissible. It will be completely permissible. So in order to better understand these, I wrote down a few examples of various types of knots that we make or we see every day, and some of them will be mutar and some of them will be asur. The first one is a kesher kaful. Kesher kaful is a double knot, right? You tie it once and you tie it again, a second knot on top of the first one. A kesher kaful is a very strong kesher. It's a strong knot. And it may even be permanent, but we don't care if it's permanent or not. It's a very strong knot. It's at least, because it's tight, it's at least asur midrabanan. It's a double knot, right? Once, and then once again on top. That's called kesher kapul. That's at least asur midrabanan. Regardless of the duration. As I just said, it's a tight knot, right? It's usually intended to last for a while too. So it's asur midrabanan, yes. We're talking about the melachot in the Mishkan. That's a good question. The kesher had to do with the nets, with the making of nets, reshatot to catch certain animals. They would occasionally need to undo the knot or redo or take a piece from here and put it there. And that would involve kesher and matir, to tie and to untie those nets. So that melacha was in the Mishkan, and from there we learned that it's a surah on Shabbat. It's a form of melacha. So that's the first example we have is the kesher kapul. It's a double knot, a sur. However, this double knot, if it's rafui, rofet, if it's loose, it's permissible to make lechatchilah. So if you make a double knot but it's very loose, there's no isur whatsoever. It's mutar. And we will see where we use that kesher kapul rofet in what situation. I'm going to get there. Yeah, that's on the other side. Okay, another type of knot which would be a sur is the kesher pashut aval batzavot. You have a simple knot, but at the very extreme, at the very end. Give you a typical example. If you ever sew a button, use a needle, how you put the thread in and you make a small little knot at the end, right? So it shouldn't come off, right? Any such knot is made that it should not come off or that it should not unravel at the very end, like a teeth, something. That type of knot, even though it's a simple knot, it's a surah, because that has permanence to it. So there you have a simple knot, but because of the situation of where that simple knot is, it's a surah. On Shabbat, we're talking about Shabbat right now, sure thing, okay? So that's called a kesher pashut, but it's only a surah because it's batzavot at the very end, and the reason for that is because it's a form of permanence, or kesher shel kayama, which is a surah, at least midrabanan. But in this case, it can be even a surah midoraita, according to some opinions. So you have to be careful. You can't do that, of course, on Shabbat, to make a kesher at the very ends of threads and so forth. Alright, then we have the famous kesher called kesher aniva, a bow tie. A bow tie by itself is not a problem. As we said before, it's not a kesher. You can easily undo it with one hand. A bow tie by itself, just the bow itself, you just make a little bow, it's not a kesher. It's perfectly fine. When does it begin to become a problem? With shoes, for example, even though I put that example of shoes on the other side. How do we tie our shoes? Before we do the bow, we first tie a simple knot. Kesher pashut, and then on top of that we make the bow. Now that bow is no longer a simple matter. Now that bow is giving strength to the lower one. So it's only mutar if it's temporary. And most of us, when we make those kind of knots, we anyway make it for temporary use because it's not a strong knot. That is why it's permissible to tie your shoes in that way. When does this bow tie become a problem? Anybody know? If you're an Ashkenazi, you would know. Ashkenazim, as you know, their Sefer Torah has a rope around it, and they tie it. And how do they tie it? With a simple tie, and then with a bow. And if you tie it mincha of Shabbat, mincha afternoon, not Shabbat, you won't be using it at the earliest till the following Monday. That's more than 24 hours. Now, we're not machmir. Most Rabbanim are not machmir in that. They allow to make the simple kesher and the bow on top of it. Because it's the sort of mitzvah, because it's not a real permanent knot. Anyway, there's various reasons. It's not a real permanent knot. We rely on the opinion that says even up to 7 days. The reason the opinion says that even up to 7 days is not called permanent. Permanence only begins after 7 days. Up to 7 days is fine. There is such an opinion. You can rely on that. But they came up with a better idea. They came up with, Velcro, I didn't think of that one, but they came up with the one with the hooks, right? You've seen those? That they put them, it has little hooks. You don't need a heaven, you don't need a rope, you don't need to tie it. Little hooks around it, you see that? And that's it, you have no problem with those. So that is just the question that I told you that I wanted to present, because we have here an aniva of al-kesher pashut, and that can cause a problem if it has any permanence to it. But if it's for the same day use, even if it's for tomorrow, right? Some say it would be okay, but within 24 hours it's for sure okay. Yes. Yeah, that's what I said. For the sort of mitzvah, certain things might be mutar, right? There isn't a thing like right, so therefore, our shoes, we tie and untie the same day within 24 hours. And as I said in the beginning, even though it may have lasted you more than 24 hours, it was intended for the same day use. It's perfectly fine. Now, a double knot you should not make. on Shabbat, unless I will give you several examples of how you can make a double knot and where you may be able to. But with shoes it's better not to, because with shoes you tend to make a tight knot, right? And if you're going to make a, what? No. You want a tie, you want it to be tight. You want it to be tight, right? So you don't want to make, it would be a problem to make a double knot, even though it's for the same day. So the double knot is a tight knot, unless it's loose, it's a surah. If it's loose, as we will see, where would you use a loose double knot? I'm going to give you an example. Yeah. Okay, good question. Good question. You can make two butterflies, I call them. You can make two bows. You can make two bows. But what you should not do is have two bows on top of a knot, on top of a kesher pashut. Yeah, two bows is fine by themselves, two bows is okay. But not two bows on top of a kesher pashut. Simple, right? Because as it is, it's already becoming stronger with the bow on top of the simple knot. If you make two bows on top of that, it's a question, it's a problem according to some. But to make two bows is okay, right? Two bows, one on top of another. There are various types of knots that are similar to bows, that I don't recall the name in English, but they would be permissible to make if they're very easily undone, and it's temporary for that day. I just don't recall the name. It's using a rope, they sometimes use a hook like to make a hook, a slip knot, exactly. That would be fine, because it can very easily come off. It's not a real knot. Exactly. So these are not real knots, just like a bow is not a real knot, a slip knot is not a real knot. You can do it perfectly fine. Yes. Yeah, because you may have a lot of thread, a lot of lace, shoelace, and you want to use it up, right? So, right, you'll have four loops, like a butterfly, right? You have one loop without making the first knot. Yeah. You should not make the first knot and then make two loops, two bows, because you don't want to make too many knots either. Right. No, the kesher kafui for sure cannot do, but even if you have two bows on top of a regular kesher, it's better not to. Yeah. She'll put it back later for you. Yeah. Anyway, so kesher aduk is a tight knot. A tight knot, as we explained before. Alright, so we said that kesher aduk, a tight knot, even though it's not made to last long, because it's tight, it's similar to a maaseh uman, it would be a surah. The next one is kesher litvach aroch, any knot, even if it's not a strong knot, it's not tight, but it was made with the intention that it should be for a long time, more than 24 hours or more than 7 days, depending which opinion you follow. It would also pose a problem, at least in the Rabbanan, it's a surah. So any knot, a simple knot, except for the one that is not considered a knot, right? But any simple knot, like a bow tie, on top of a kesher pashut, if you intend to do it for a long time, it would be a surah. When would you want to do something for a long time? I'll give you an example. With the hair of girls, you know how they put how do you call those things? Ribbon that you want it to stay for a long time. That would be a surah. So that's litvach aroch, that's for a long extended period of time. So it would still, even if it's less than 24, you still have to know how to make it. It can't be a kesher that would be maaseh uman. It can't be too tight. So if it's a simple knot, as we said before, or with a bow, that would be permissible. That would not be permissible. No, for a long time. Right. We're machmir past 24 hours, but some say it's okay up to 7 days. Right? For a week, anything that's supposed to just last for a week, some say it's not permanent. Some say it's 24 hours. Right. So depending on how it is, what kind of a knot it is, we still have to look not only at the duration, we also need to look at the type of knot. That it's not a very tight knot. It's a form of knot that is very difficult to undo, like a double knot. Right? Okay, so now let's see some examples. With the simple knot that we make with the plastic bag, that we put some food put away in the freezer, just a small little knot, it's a one knot, that's mutar. Even though you're putting it away, right? Yeah, you just tie it by itself on top, that's fine, right? That's not a major knot. Even though you're putting it away, that's very simple, it's very easily undone, right? It's not considered a kesher. And then we have several examples of various knots of where we would make, I wrote them together here, aniva, ta'if, dinar, a necktie that you were asking about, snood, I think they call it, a scarf, but I didn't write scarf because a scarf can be a neck scarf, right? My wife had called it, or in Yiddish it's called, I'll tell you what happens. A ticho in Yiddish, and a sinar is an apron. Okay, now what happens? You have different types of knots here. You have 3 different types of knots. The necktie appears the most complicated one, but it's mutar. It's mutar to make a necktie because it's made to only last for the day. Most men undo their neckties, right, after coming home, after taking off the tie. Better for the tie too, yeah. And it's not a very tight professional knot to begin with. Even though it appears to be more complex type of a knot, it's not a simple knot. But the way it's made, the way it's formed, because of the way it's used and the ease of which it can be undone, it's not considered a professional knot, and for sure not a long-term knot, and therefore it's permissible to make. No, everybody is mekelu with it. So I'm making one instead of two. Yeah. Right. You're right. Yeah, there are some. I should say you're right. There are some more stricter with this, but the halakha, the minhag, is that we're not machmir because of the short duration of it. It's intended to be short duration, and it's not a very tight knot anyway. It's easily undone. But you are right. Some may be stricter with it. With the snoot, the best way to deal with the snoot, you can have a double knot on the snoot. This is the one that I was talking about, a double knot, but a loose one. It will work first. Right in the back, when you cover your hair, and you have the edges. How are you going to tie it? You're going to use a double knot, maybe, unless you want to do it in a different way. So you can use a double knot there, but it's going to be loose. And you want it to be loose because you eventually want to take it off. Double knots that are not loose are very hard to undo. You have to sit there, depending on what it's made of. So it's the if, or it's loose, if it has a double knot, but it's loose, it's important that it be loose, otherwise it's a suit. So you're allowed to make a double knot that is loose. So this would be one case where you would want to do that maybe. With an apron, the custom is not to make a double knot, because the way that just aprons are different. I read that the best way to deal with an apron is to make a bow tie, not a double knot. That's the easiest way to undo it, and just put it together, and not a double knot. So right, like a shoelace. But that's the best way to deal with an apron, and can be made to last long. So it really makes no difference if you're going to use it just for a short time. If it's tight, it gives that appearance, but it's not still money in the food. So unless it's loose, you can't make it loose and make a bow tie. With shoes, I already explained before that it's usually not a problem unless somehow you intend to leave it for weeks and weeks, the knot. Then of course it would be a shoe with shoes too. Not always. No? You can sometimes take off your shoe just by slipping it off and slipping it in. Then it would be a sur. I mean, theoretically, if somebody would not want to tie and untie his shoes, he would want to make it once and just leave it that way, it would be a sur, because of the duration problem. This kesher becomes a kesher shel kayama. Even with a shoe kesher, you have a simple knot with a bow on top of it. Because he intends it to be like that for weeks or months, then it would be a sur for him to do so if he knows he's going to do it though. The only reason we are allowing him to do so is only because it's for short duration. Okay, another type of knot which is a tool to make is hiduk, or tightening. This is very common with tzitzit. With tzitzit, you have various knots on the tzitzit. You cannot tighten them. Next week, with Hashem, we'll talk about buttons, loose buttons. What do you do with loose buttons that the string is coming off? As far as we'll talk about, that's already under a different melacha. But here, it will be a tool to tighten the tzitzit, tighten the knots. Even though the knots are already made, the tightening of them is also in a sense contributing to the kesher. And the same is true with hosafat kesher. Let's say you already have a double knot. Now you say, well, I just want to be sure this is strong. I'm going to make a third knot. There's already two knots there. The third knot is not with us. Just because there are two knots there already does not mean that you can make an additional knot. The additional knot would also be prohibited. But that's called adding an extra knot would also be fall under the category of kosher, which is a form of kosher, which is also. Now comes a very interesting one. There's a very interesting question in the 20th and 21st century. Something that did not exist many years ago. I think they're called metal twisters, right? You go to the bakery, or you have your own, right? And you want to put away something, you want to undo it, you want to open it. Twist ties. Yeah, they're usually from metal, right? From plastic, from metal, yeah. So there are several rabbinic opinions in this matter that hold that one should be careful not to use them on Shabbat, because by twisting them, you're tying it, and you're tying it very tightly. Don't worry too much about it, because we are not mahmir, okay? We're not very stringent in this area, for a variety of reasons. One explanation given, is that this is not a real form of kesher. This is, what's happening over here, is we're not making a knot. It's the pressure applied by the metal that's causing this to close. In other words, it's a different situation here. It does not resemble knot, even though it has a similar effect of closing the bag, right? How this effect comes about is different than a regular knot. It's definitely not a professional knot. It's just the pressure of the metal being applied here, right? So there's quite a few rabbis who say it's completely mutar. Some say make a compromise. If you want to use it only for things that you plan to reopen during that day. Or just make one twist and not many twists. I use it. Yeah, because it's not a real kesher. It's not a real knot. Even though it appears to be, it has the same effect. It has the same effect as a knot. But that's not the way a knot is made, by twisting the two together. Even though with braiding, with thread, braiding is a sur. Braiding is the combining of many threads into one, into a thicker one. This is just one piece of metal, and the way it closes the bag or whatever it is that you're closing is not in the it does not happen in the same way that a kesher does it. No, go on. Yeah, you can't tear it. Right. Yeah, if it's a loose knot. Yeah, sure, that's not a problem. Yeah, because you didn't do anything. It's loose, a loose knot. But you have to be careful with loose threads. Very easy to make it tight. With a very thin thread, if you just make a small knot, it's very difficult to undo. Right? No. That's what we do with shoelaces, right? We first make, right. Yeah, what you cannot do is you cannot take two ropes, for example, and combine them together with a knot. But if you have one and it's a loose knot that you just tie it, there's no issue. You didn't do it. What? Tight would be a problem. Sure. Yeah. If it's a simple knot that's not tight, right? Tightness is a problem. Right. Using safety things would be a problem. Carrying. We'll eventually get to that, I think. Hopefully, carrying. How to carry if you need to carry something. Right. Yeah. Under certain circumstances, you can use a goy for certain things. Alright, so these twisters are usually not a problem, especially if you plan to use what you're using during the same day. Then everybody would agree it's okay. Lulav. You may not have seen it too much. It's more common by Ashkenazim that they use special knots, special ksharim to tie the lulav from the palm leaf itself. Have you seen that? Like they put three on the lulav to hold the lulav itself together, then to hold everything else together. Just like it's a sur on Shabbat to make knots, it's a sur to make on Yom Tov knots. So anybody that forgot to make knots, and he needs it for the lulav, he cannot make those beautiful knots. They're very professional knots on Yom Tov. Nevertheless, since he wants to hold it together, what should he do? He can take those pieces of the leaves that are used with the palm tree, put it around, and then tuck it inside. If you tuck it inside, you're not making a real kesher. Right? So you basically surrounded it, and then you're tucking the ends inside. That would be permissible. That you can do, because the lulav should be together. So if I didn't do something else, they do everything together without those special knots. They use rubber band, aluminum foil, or whatever. Yeah, because when you wrap something, that's the word I was looking for. When you wrap something around, and then you tuck in the ends, you're not tying. All you're doing is wrapping, and then you're taking the ends and you're tucking them inside, right? That's not a kesher. That would be permissible. That's a one way of holding something together. It's not very strong, but for the lulav, it would be fine. Perfectly fine. Okay, let's quickly go over to matir. There's a klal. The rule of thumb is with matir that anything that is a sur midoraita to tie, to make a knot, it's a sur to untie, to undo. That's the rule. The basic rule is whatever we cannot do midoraita, according to the Torah, tie, we can also not untie. The sur. But there are certain leniencies when it comes to matir. Leniencies, they have to basically, what they have to do is with those that are prohibited midrabanan. Those that were prohibited midrabanan to tie, you may be able to untie them, depending on the circumstances. For example, one example would be food. The bakery usually puts string around the box, the cake, and it's a very tight knot. You can undo it for a variety of reasons. Reason number one, first of all, it's the food. For food, there are several things that are mutar to undo. It's only midrabanan here. Why? Because the bakery only intended to be for short duration, because you can open it that very same day that you bought it. You follow me? So the whole kavanah, remember kavanah was important, what the intention of the kesher was. In a temporary kesher, it's important what the kavanah was. The intention was to make it temporary. So for a variety of reasons, there will be no problem to untying or undoing a knot, especially if it's around a box. The only time you run into a problem with undoing a knot, even if it's for food, is if it's a kesher, which is midoraita asura, a real professional permanent knot. What do you do then? In that case, it's better not to untie it, because it's a sur. You sever it with a knife or whatever. Severing it is not a melacha. Right? If it's a normal knot, you don't want to simply sever, because we don't do that just for nothing. Right? It's better to untie it, because it's permissible to untie. But in a case where untying would pose a problem, because it's a kesher that's a sur midoraita, then the best solution would be to sever it. You don't want to do this in front of people who are ignorant of the halacha. They might get the wrong idea that it's permissible to do these kind of things here and do all these kind of things everywhere. So you have to be careful with your surroundings, who is watching you. But that's the right thing to do if it's a real big kesher, very difficult to undo, or kesher which would be a sur midoraita to undo. What is that? Anywhere. No, it doesn't matter. You could just sever it. Not really. You shouldn't do this. You use a knife. Because the scissors in reality is a klisha melachtoli isur. Yeah. Well, the sort of this? Right. Yeah, you're right. There are situations, for example, I'll give you an example, there are certain scissors that are specially made for chicken, right? That would be perfectly fine. But you're right. Anytime that you have something which is mutar to do, it would be permissible to use a hammer or things which are munseshit. It's melachtoli isur. So depending on what you're doing, it might be okay. Yeah, the only thing is that knife is better. There's certain kelim that are better because of the way it's done. Certain things give the appearance of what's called in Shabbat uda dehol. And we talked about it in Tochen, I believe it was, where you have graters, for example. Right? You can cut something with a knife, or you can cut something with a peeler, right? Peeling it. What's better? But some things, because they're used during the week, for something, it appears that you're doing something that is not in the spirit of Shabbat. Doesn't mean it's asur. So I prefer to use a knife always available instead of going to the drawer and pulling out something which happens to be together with thread and needles and the like. It's not around the kitchen today. Okay, another kesha that is mutar to open up, to untie, to undo is a kesha beli kavanah. Sometimes it can happen that you, by mistake, you made a knot, a double knot or a hard knot, a tight knot. You didn't intend it to be so. It can happen. Or something got tangled up by mistake. You will be able to undo it. Why? Because anything that is by mistake, anything that's unintentional, was never intended to be permanent. Right? Yeah, but those are bigger problems. Yeah? First of all, over there with the hair, you have other problems. You may come to tear, to pull out. Yeah. And with the sheitel, we said that there was a problem with braiding and unbraiding. Right? That we spoke about last week. The braids, if you have, not necessarily knots, but knots would also be somewhat of a problem, not as much as with the hair. Right? And we said that it's always best to use a soft comb so that you should not come to tear or to pull out the fibers. Right. Yeah, that's what's used. Especially for Shabbat. For Shabbat, that's the best comb to use. Unless you have very soft hair, and the comb that you use is never a problem. Then of course you can use it. But we have to be very careful when you're using regular combs, because it can very easily come to pull out a hair. So that is why it's always recommended to use a soft comb. Yeah, you were playing around, you were doing something, and it became a knot. You can undo it. But you cannot use a comb, a hard comb, to break it. Right, exactly. Yeah. If it was unintentional, right, then there's no sort of being matir the kesher. You just have to be careful with the other problem of not tearing it. That's all. Okay, and the last item is letzorech gadol al yidei goy. In other words, as we said, there are certain leniency, matir versus kosher, because with kosher, something can be asur midrabanan. For example, more than 24 hours, according to some opinion, is already some degree of permanence. Even though it's a small, loose, unprofessional knot, because of its duration, it can be at least asur midrabanan. However, to undo them, if there's some need, right, you may be able to undo them. It all depending on what kind of a kesher it is. Letzorech gadol, if there is a tremendous need. Let's say you have shoes, okay, that somehow became very, very tight, the knots. You know how sometimes it's very difficult to undo kids' shoes or whatever. They got very, very tight. And it's pretty tight, or it's not a permanent knot, but it's been there for a while, and now you cannot easily undo it, unless, I don't know what, tear it, but you don't want to tear it either. You are allowed to use a goy to undo it. So even though this is a tight knot, a stronger knot, if there's a great need, a tourniquet. You know what a tourniquet is? How do you pronounce it? Tourniquet, right? Right? That you put what? Let's say you're in pain and you want to remove something, and it's one of those knots that is a tight knot, it's a good knot, it's not necessarily a professional knot, but it's a knot that is asur midrabanan. We're not talking about food over here, right? So there's no heter to open it up because of the food. It would be mutar to use a goy to undo it for you. Anytime something is asur midrabanan, forbidden decree, and the individual is mitzta'er, he's in pain, the Rabbanan lo gazru, they did not decree that it should be prohibited in those situations. And that is why when we talk about the reports, medication, depending on how sick a person is, there are certain things that may be assumed Rabbanan, that it would be permissible for him to do either on his own or through a goy. So there are situations when we employ a goy, but don't make the mistake ever to think that it's okay to use a goy for everything, because the rule is always the same. Whatever is asur for us to do, it's asur for us to do through a goy, with certain exceptions. So there was a term used in Europe and other countries called a Shabbos goy. And people confuse it. Shabbos goy, that means I can use the Shabbos goy for this and for that and for this. No, you can't use it for everything. There are certain situations in Midrabanan, or certain situations which are even assumed Doraita, but it's permissible to use the goy. There are certain exceptions. The Chachamim allowed for us to use the goy. And B'ezrat Hashem will be talking about that. That is a subject by itself called Amira Ve'akum. When can you instruct the goy to do something, and when not? B'ezrat Hashem, when we finish the Menachot. I think by today we've covered 22 Menachot out of the 39, and the following B'ezrat Hashem weeks we'll be covering a few more. Sometime after the Chagim, B'ezrat Hashem will be done with the Shabbat. It's taking a little longer than what I expected because some Menachot I thought I could do faster, but there are quite a few details. Anyway, so the last item here is if there is a great need to undo a knot, right, that is not a professional, it's a tight knot, one solution, one way to go about it is to go. Otherwise, the halachot of matir and kosher are very similar. One has to be just as careful untying as with tying. And tying a knot is basically, unless if it's for the short duration and a very simple knot, like with a bow, would be permissible. Otherwise, one has to be careful. If there's any degree of permanence to it, if it's more than 24 hours, you have to be concerned. You have to be careful not to do it. And the same thing with matir. If it's some degree of permanence or if it's a tight knot, just can't undo it on Shabbat because you need to. Unless it was the lo chavana, unintended, or if it's food, or if it's the tzorech gadol, there's a great need, you're in pain, and it's a problem. I was talking about the shoes. You can't put your feet into the shoe unless you undo it. You could undo it, right? What? And double knot, which is a sumid rabbanat. So in those kind of situations, you can see how matir is a little bit more lenient than kosher. The kosher would be assumed at least with the rabbanan. Matir would be mutar under certain situations if there is a Torah, with some need. But that's only if it's with the rabbanan. If it's with the raita, it would still not be permitted. And with food, you would have to tear it. Instead of tearing it would be the best solution than to undo a knot which is restored with the raita. But if it's with the rabbanan, you have several leniencies. Okay, that's all for today. B'ezrat Hashem continue next week with B'ezrat Hashem with Sofer in Korea, tearing. After which B'ezrat Hashem will talk about several melachot that have to do with hunting. How they used to make the hides. They used to hunt the animal, to capture the animal, then they skin it, and how do they prepare the skin, the hide, the nachek, they would process it. There's several melachot that have to do with hunting. Yes. When we talk about hunting for us means to capture, not to kill. Latsud, right? We need to slaughter the animal, which is also part of that, by the way. The shechita itself is also a melacha. All of this is in preparation of removing the hides and then using it for whatever. So that's B'ezrat Hashem. I don't know if we'll do all of that in the next 2 weeks, but B'ezrat Hashem in the next 3 weeks we'll cover all of that. Any questions? Okay. Yeah. Right. But it's a sur. Yeah. If it's maseh uman, if it's a professional knot, or if it's a kesher shel kayama, if it's a permanent knot. And according to the Rambam, you need both conditions for it to be a sur midoraita. So kesher shel kayama and maseh uman. But according to Rashi, many other rabbis, as long as it's just a kesher shel kayama, they don't consider if it's professional or not. Something that was done for permanence, for long duration, is already a sur midoraita. So one has to be careful regardless of the condition. If it has any one of the two, it can't be a sur midoraita, especially if it's a kesher shel kayama. But if it's not, if there's only one, it's at least a sur midoraita. Yeah, according to Rashi, that's all you need is a kesher shel kayama for it to be a sur midoraita. Right. But according to Rashi, if that one is kesher shel kayama, it's already a sur midoraita. Right. So we're careful with either one of the two conditions, and it's at least a sur midoraita. Then there was a question of duration. How long is duration? Whether it's more than 24 hours, whether it's 7 days. So we are machmir on that because of the opinions that hold anything over 24 hours already has some degree of kayama. So depending on the type of knot we make, it can be mutar. But even if it's a simple knot, you have to be careful. If your intention is for a long time, if this should be for a while, it would be a sur. Unless it's just a little simple knot, which is not considered a knot to begin with. So these are the concepts that one has to have in mind when you're making a knot. Ask yourself, what kind of a knot am I making here? And what is it for? Is it just for now? Do I plan to open it up later? Or not? Because it can be a sur. At least think it up a knot. Okay, that does it.